Hello and welcome to AiArthritis Voices 360. This is the official talk show for AiArthritis, which is short for International Foundation for Autoimmune and Autoinflammatory Arthritis. My name is Tiffany Westrich-Robertson. I am the original founder of the organization, CEO, and person living with non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis, among some other conditions as well. And this is a very special episode for me personally, because one of the reasons I founded this organization was because I started off as a mystery patient and then quickly after that diagnosed with what's called undifferentiated connective tissue disease, which falls under the umbrella of undifferentiated disease, which we're going to talk about today. What is this diagnosis? And how could a diagnosis like this affect me? And what does it mean in the realm of moving on to another diagnosis or staying with this this diagnosis? And, I have to say, back in 2007, when I went from mystery patient to undifferentiated connective tissue disease, it was presented to me as if this wasn't a real diagnosis. The doctor, who was a rheumatologist, essentially said it's something connective tissue, which means it could be RA, it could be Sjogren's disease, it could be scleroderma, it could be lupus, it could just be many of these things. But it's too early to know is the way that it was framed to me, because essentially undifferentiated means the symptoms could be sort of all over the place, but none specific enough to go under a classification of a different, I'm going to say a different specific disease, because that's where I got confused. Because often it'll be said it's not enough to warrant a diagnosis. Well, it is a diagnosis. Undifferentiated disease is a diagnosis. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about why that's important for patients to understand, because it impacts not only just the mental overview of it, but also treatment plans and prognosis. So essentially, I was told, you have this. So going back to my story, I was told, okay, you have this disease. So what are we going to do about it? And the answer that I received was, well, I need to know what this may turn into. And for that reason, we're going to wait and watch you get worse. Again, this was back in 2007. And I did get worse. I got a lot worse. And I ended up getting so bad over about an 8-month period that I couldn't hardly stay awake. I was sleeping about 16 hours a day. Because of this extreme fatigue, I felt like I kind of had the flu all the time. I did have an array of different symptoms. I had sort of this joint pain. I had pain in my tailbone. I had pain on kind of one side of my body. It wasn't on the other side, which is very indicative of rheumatoid arthritis. I was getting little like canker sores on my tongue. And they're like, well, I don't know what that has to do with anything. That kind of goes along with Sjogren's disease a little bit. And so there was no definite arrow pointing in one direction. It was kind of like, could this be spondyloarthritis? Could this be RA? Could this be? Could this be? Could this be? And it made me feel incomplete. It made me feel like, okay, they're telling me there's nothing we can do and I can't be treated. And the only thing that is a solution is to wait and get worse, which was unacceptable. And that really was my inspiration for starting this organization, which has turned into a full-fledged foundation. And we're going to talk a little bit about how the work that we're doing with undifferentiated disease and educating you today can also lead to some of the other programs we're doing in the research department in particular. So first of all, have you been diagnosed with undifferentiated disease or a variation of them? This could be undifferentiated spondyloarthritis. Sometimes you might hear it in undifferentiated autoinflammatory disease or an undifferentiated autoimmune disease. It's a kind of unfortunate there's so many that could fall under this umbrella. The most common you'll hear is undifferentiated connective tissue disease, though. And while there is no specific diagnostic criteria, even today, which blows my mind for undifferentiated connective tissue disease. It's more further along in research and an understanding of what it is than some of the others that I mentioned. And so I think for that reason, it's often the go-to of the things that fall under the undifferentiated disease umbrella. So first, I'd really love to know, have you been diagnosed with any of the forms of undifferentiated disease? And please tell us. We're going to be posting this on social media, and we also will have a blog post about it on our website. And we would love to hear your story, because we have a very strong focus on this, because we have always believed since our inception in 2011, based on listening to patient voices and patient stories like my own, that most of us start at some where we could possibly get this diagnosis of undifferentiated something, connective tissue disease in my case. But what mostly happens is patients will often have many of these symptoms and they get no diagnosis. So they're just stay as a mystery patient, but it could be a diagnosis. And why is that important? Well, studies show anywhere from like 15 to maybe 30 now, they've gone up a little bit, are patients that actually have an undifferentiated disease. AiArthritis believes it's more like 50%. And we proved that theory in 2013 in our first research project called the Early Symptoms of AiArthritis Diseases. And we will link to this project for you. It's very fascinating. There was hundreds of patients around the world who participated. And while approximately 15%, which is in keeping with publications, were in fact diagnosed with undifferentiated disease first, another 38% met a kind of a criteria of what could be diagnosed as undifferentiated connective tissue disease, meaning they had the fatigue, they had random joint pain and some of these other rashes or other symptoms that fall under that, but they had no diagnosis, or if they did, they weren't told. And it was 54%. So we consider this a high priority diagnosis for that reason. Secondly, because we want patients to be proactive about getting on a treatment plan if they are diagnosed with this undifferentiated disease. Why? Because we already know that early intervention is the best way to achieve remission. We don't often hear remission in our diseases, and that's too often because of a delay in diagnosis, a delay in treatment, patients feeling like maybe I'll wait and watch till I get worse and before I start a treatment. But research after research after research shows early intervention has better outcomes because you actually can go in remission and maybe never have to be on medications for the rest of your life. It's possible, but it's possible most often with early intervention. And there's no earlier than undifferentiated disease. So there's a lot of studies. We do a program called Go With Us, 2 conferences, primarily the American College of Rheumatology every November, and also EULAR, which is the European Congress, the European Rheumatology Group. And that happens in June. So make sure you sign up for that. And part of that is we go to these sessions and we learn about what's happening in research, what's happening in our diseases, in our treatments. And one of the focuses that I have seen over the last few years is undifferentiated disease. So at EULAR 2023, I went to a session, and we will link to a clip. There's a clip on YouTube. You can hear me talking about this. And we're also, as I mentioned, going to have a blog post and doing a lot more work in undifferentiated over the next several years. So you definitely listen to that. But it started talking about how researchers and doctors are really focusing in on this as an early disease. And that is important because they're starting to also sort of create this line of when are you undifferentiated disease and you might stay undifferentiated disease, which I want to say again, isn't a bad thing. I thought that was a bad thing. It is not a bad thing. It just simply, as long as you get treatment, I think that's the important thing here, and you don't wait and get worse. So treatment, intervention, when there's undifferentiated disease, important. Second, and contact us about how to talk to doctors about that. That's one of the things we want to pull out of this episode is creating patient peer-led recommendations, working with our rheumatologists too, to create a dialogue on how, if you have undifferentiated disease, you can talk about interventions and treatments. So what the research is showing is there's this break where they're starting to identify, in some cases, based on biomarkers, which are, they'll take your blood, they'll look at different markers, like you may have heard of rheumatoid factor or ANCA, or just different biomarkers, different readings in your blood that may indicate this could be going closer to Sjogren's. This could be going closer to lupus, that paired with certain symptoms. So take lupus, for example, certain biomarkers may point to it, and then you may have a molar rash, a rash on your face. Then they start looking down. So there's efforts to start to kind of rearrange these symptoms and say symptoms plus biomarkers and undifferentiated could lead us down this direction. And maybe that's a better way to think about early intervention and treatments, because even though many of our diseases are treated with the same biologics, there are different biologics that work better for different diseases. So there's going to be some that are going to work better for lupus than rheumatoid arthritis, for example. And that's one of the reasons that this kind of early treatment of undifferentiated disease is up in the air, because the doctors don't want to put you on the wrong direction. In saying that, what are current treatments? So often they will start you on an NSAID. So think of like an ibuprofen. Maybe prescription level, maybe not. And that's what I was started on, because I had also this terrible pain in my chest, which is called costochondritis. And what I learned later in my education of going to these conferences, and the program Go With Us to Conferences, is that is a form of what's called enthesitis. And that is an inflammation in the kind of where the tendons and the bone connect in your ribs. So it almost feels like a heart attack. And so that was one of my undifferentiated signs. But enthesitis is very prominent in spondyloarthritis diseases, which is my current diagnosis. So if you kind of think about this, let's track my symptoms. I have undifferentiated. Let's work with the doctor. Maybe if I get some biomarkers that point in a direction, maybe if I pick and choose these symptoms, it can start a map and it can get them to some better answers. But in the interim, talking about what can we do for intervention? Is it at least some kind of NSAID, right? Then there's also discussion of starting on a DMARD or a disease-modifying agent, which could be like a methotrexate. If it's there's a common. I'm on leflutamide, for example. So that's kind of like the next step. There are some patients who hydroxychloroquine, or hydroxychloroquine, excuse me. And that is often if you're more on seeming like a lupus route, and steroids. Now, there's a lot of movement too to move away from the steroids, very short term type of situation, because we need to get patients off of long-term steroids. So that's another reason why kind of talking about the options and maybe an earlier, more aggressive intervention could put you in remission. So those are the things we're trying to study and work on at AiArthritis. In saying that, so that's what undifferentiated disease is, and sort of how this diagnostic or kind of figuring out this mystery goes, and also that it is a real diagnosis. So I want people to feel like they have some kind of answer, because I know when I had it, I just felt incomplete, and I don't want anyone to feel that way. It is a real disease, and it may never progress to another disease, and that's okay. Often that means that the outcomes aren't as severe. So don't look at that as a negative. Look at it as a glass half full, right? The outcomes usually don't lead to the joint deformities or such aggressive comorbidities or additional diagnosis. So if it doesn't get to the point where this looks like it's breaking off and it's staying in undifferentiated, that's not a bad thing. The other thing that we wanted to talk about in this, so we talked about what it is and how the diagnosis could affect you, and then kind of what are the next steps. We talked a little bit about treatment. What can you do? You're diagnosed with an undifferentiated disease. What happens next? Well, as I mentioned, There's a few things that we would like to help as peers help you with when you are diagnosed with this disease. And the first thing is let us know your story. Even if you have progressed from undifferentiated like me, we still want to hear your story because we are starting to do research specifically on this disease to help researchers and doctors with identifying it, identifying more where that break is, where it might progress to a different disease, dialogue about treatment and disease management. We really want to be at the forefront of this. And so in doing that, we want to hear from you. That's how all of the data that we collect starts. We listen to our peers and we start to figure out what you need. And that's the first step. So make sure you click on the link to this episode and fill out the form to tell us your undifferentiated disease diagnosis story. Secondly, we want to make sure that you are understanding the potential treatment plans. So we want to make sure that we give you guidance and you can contribute to helping us create this guidance as we navigate through undifferentiated disease to make sure that there is a treatment plan and wait and watch it get worse. We want to really politely push back on that or at least get more context to this because we know that it's something that we don't want to push off for too long. Start thinking about when is the break-off point where it starts to become another disease. And then even with that becomes an early intervention for a lupus or an early intervention for a psoriatic arthritis, early intervention for Sjogren's. Let us walk you through that path. The third part of it is how you can get involved past sharing a story and past participating in these kind of guidance and diagnostic guidance and communication with our doctor guidance that we're working on. The third part is research. AiArthritis has launched the AiArthritis Research Databank, which is living inside Forward National Databank for Rheumatic Diseases. It is an international databank, and it is designed for our 24 diseases. One of the focus features that we're doing is we're studying undifferentiated disease and the mystery patient. So since we know, because of the study I referenced earlier with the early symptoms of AiArthritis diseases that we we led in 2013, we know that about 50% of patients, either 50% will meet some type of criteria that falls under this undifferentiated disease, even if 15 to 30% of them only have the diagnosis. So if you have certain symptoms, and we will list these symptoms, you're going to fall under, could be a variety of pick and choose, can be fatigue is almost always involved, some level of kind of joint pain. Then it can branch off to your eyes are infected, your certain organs may be infected. I mentioned canker sores. You could have rashes. You could have different levels of muscle pain. It's like every symptom that could be associated with any of our diseases could fall under it. And that's what makes it so confusing. But if we get you a checklist and help you to start navigating this, and then also invite anyone who doesn't even have a diagnosis yet, but meets all of this kind of criteria, so maybe you do have it, we want you in the database because the goal is not only to follow people through a diagnosis with our help on the side. So it's not even just a regular database or research. You would be working with your peers to get some guidance and get some health education along the way and tips on how to speak to the doctors to navigate through this. So we're there for you in addition to the research. In addition to the research, you're getting guidance along with it. So then our goal of that research is to identify people in real time getting the diagnosis. How long did it take? Why? We can go back and start asking you questions. You can be part of conversations where we as patients start to figure out the why. Why did this take so long? And then we can work with the researchers to try to find novel ways of identifying these diseases earlier, better ways of talking to the doctors to expedite diagnosis. And then also those with existing undifferentiated disease, we really want to study how many are moving on to other diseases, and where is that breaking point that we're starting to see at these conferences where they're starting to look at what the breaking point looks like. We want to help these researchers by capturing that. So I really hope that you will participate in our work to help those diagnosed with undifferentiated disease, and also to help with our research and education, health education work, to help those navigate, those with this diagnosis or mystery patients navigate through getting to either staying at an undifferentiated disease diagnosis or moving on to the next, helping research advance our treatments. We can do this together. So thank you so much for tuning in. We know there's a lot of you out there. We understand. We say we don't represent the patient voice. We are the patient voice, and we stand true to that. So thank you for joining in on this episode of AI Arthritis Voices 360. I'm very excited to be personally working with many of you around the world on this very important initiative. Also, when you're checking out the episode on our website, check out all of them. We have over 100. What? It's true. And also hit that donate button, because your gift helps us be able to continue not only the show, but all of the work that I just mentioned in research and health education, being able to have peer-to-peer conversations and support. We do a lot for our community thanks to your support. So thank you for that. All right, that's it. I am signing off here from AI Arthritis Voices 360. Have a fabulous day, and don't forget to pull up your seat at the table, because only when we unite can we make change.